The ink on the letter had smudged where Miriam Keller's tears had fallen, but she forced herself to keep writing the lies that might save her family's ranch and perhaps her own life. The year was 1882, and the New Mexico Territory sun beat down mercilessly on Las Cruces, turning the adobe walls of her family's hacienda into an oven that matched the heat of her desperation. She dipped her pen again and continued the deception, knowing that somewhere in Colorado, a cowboy named Benjamin Reed would read her carefully crafted words and believe she was the picture of frontier prosperity, rather than a woman whose father lay 6 feet under, and whose ranch was being slowly strangled by men who wanted to take everything she had left. Miriam sealed the letter with wax, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed her father's signet ring into the red pool. The matrimonial advertisement she had placed in the Denver newspaper 3 months ago had seemed like her only option then, and it seemed even more desperate now. She had described herself honestly enough: 22 years old, capable, educated by her mother who had been a schoolteacher before consumption took her when Miriam was 16. But she had lied about everything else. The ranch was not thriving. The cattle were not numerous and healthy. Her father was not simply looking to retire and see his daughter settled. Her father was dead, murdered by one of Clayton Moss's men 6 weeks ago when he refused to sell the water rights that had been in the Keller family since her grandfather's time. She walked to the window and looked out across the parched land. The Oregon mountains rose in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the blue sky like broken teeth. Somewhere out there, Clayton Moss sat in his sprawling ranch house, counting the days until she would have no choice but to sell to him or lose everything to the bank. He had made his intentions clear the day after her father's funeral, standing in this very room with his hat in his hands and his eyes cold as a snake's. "Miss Keller," he had said, "a woman alone cannot run a ranch. Your father was a stubborn man and it cost him his life. I would hate to see you follow the same path." It was not a threat exactly, but the message was clear enough. Sell or suffer the same fate. But Miriam had her mother's stubbornness and her father's pride, and she had sent Clayton Moss away without an answer. That night, she had written the first letter to Benjamin Reed, the cowboy from Colorado who had responded to her advertisement with a letter so honest and straightforward, it had made her heart ache with guilt for what she was about to do. Benjamin Reed was not a wealthy man, he had written, but he was honest and hardworking. He had spent the last 10 years working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, saving every penny he could. He was 30 years old, never married, and he wanted to settle down with a good woman and build something permanent. His handwriting was careful and neat, the words simple but sincere. He asked questions about her life, her interests, her hopes for the future. He told her about his own childhood in Missouri, orphaned at 12, and raised by an uncle who taught him everything about horses and cattle and the hard business of survival in the West. Over the following weeks, Miriam had written back, weaving a tapestry of half-truths and outright lies. Yes, the ranch was doing well. Yes, her father was in good health and looking forward to meeting him. Yes, she had help enough to manage the property. The lies came easier with each letter, justified by the desperate circumstances that drove her pen. She told herself that once Benjamin arrived, once they were married, she would find a way to tell him the truth. A husband would give her the protection of a man's name, would make Clayton Moss think twice about his schemes. She would work hard, be a good wife, make up for the deception somehow. But as the weeks passed and her situation grew more dire, the lies grew larger. She wrote about spring calving that had never happened, about cattle sales that had never been made, about ranch hands who had long since left when she could no longer pay their wages. The only people left on the property now were herself, old Maria, who had been her nurse as a child and now served as cook and housekeeper, and Juan, Maria's son, who was barely 18 but worked like 3 men to keep the ranch from falling apart entirely. Now, standing at the window with the latest letter in her hand, Miriam wondered if Benjamin Reed would even come. His last letter had asked pointed questions, gentle but probing, as if he sensed something beneath her cheerful descriptions of ranch life. He had written about the importance of honesty between a husband and wife, about building a marriage on truth rather than illusions. Reading those words had felt like a knife twisting in her chest, but what choice did she have? If she told him the truth now, he would never come. And without him, without the protection of marriage and a man's presence, she would lose everything. She walked through the quiet house, her footsteps echoing on the tile floors her grandfather had laid 40 years ago. The hacienda had been built in the Spanish style. Thick adobe walls and a courtyard with a fountain that no longer ran because the well was running dry. Her father's study still smelled faintly of tobacco and leather, and she avoided looking at the dark stain on the floor where he had fallen when Clayton Moss's foreman put a bullet through his heart. They had called it self-defense, claimed her father had drawn first, and the sheriff had barely investigated before ruling it a fair shooting. That was the way of things when a man like Clayton Moss wanted something. The law bent to accommodate him. Miriam found Maria in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with strong, weathered hands. The older woman looked up as she entered, her dark eyes seeing too much as always. "You sent another letter to this cowboy?" Maria asked in Spanish, which they spoke together when alone. "Yes," Miriam replied in the same language. "He should arrive within the month. And when he sees how things truly are, when he learns about your father, about Clayton Moss, about the debts—" "I will tell him," Miriam said, though the words felt hollow. "When he is here, I will explain everything." Maria made a soft sound that might have been sympathy or disapproval or both. "Men do not like to be deceived, child, even by a woman as desperate as you. What else can I do?" Miriam's voice cracked, the careful composure she maintained slipping for just a moment. "Should I let Clayton Moss take this land? Should I let my father's murder mean nothing?" Maria's expression softened. She wiped her hands on her apron and came to embrace Miriam, holding her as she had when Miriam was a child waking from nightmares. "Your father would not want you to sacrifice yourself this way. Perhaps it would be better to let the ranch go, to go east where you could be safe." But Miriam pulled away, shaking her head. "This is my home. My grandfather built this place with his own hands. My father died defending it. I will not abandon it without a fight." 2 weeks later, Juan came riding up to the house at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat despite the early morning hour. Miriam was in the barn trying to repair a broken stall door with wood that had warped in the dry heat, and she emerged to find the young man dismounting quickly. "Riders coming," he said, breathing hard. "From the north road, a single man leading a pack horse." Miriam's heart leaped into her throat. Benjamin Reed. He was early, arriving weeks before she had expected him. She looked down at herself, at the worn work dress and scuffed boots, at her hands calloused from labor she had never admitted to in her letters. There was no time to change, no time to prepare. He was coming. She walked to the front of the house, her mind racing through explanations and excuses, and waited. The sun was climbing higher, already promising another scorching day. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the approach of a rider, and Miriam felt her stomach twist with anxiety. Everything depended on the next few hours. If Benjamin Reed turned around and left when he saw the truth of her situation, she would have nothing left. No options, no hope, no future except whatever Clayton Moss decided to allow her. The rider materialized out of the heat shimmer, and Miriam got her first real look at the man she had been lying to for 3 months. Benjamin Reed sat tall in the saddle, his frame lean and hard from years of working cattle. He wore a dusty brown hat, a faded blue shirt, and chaps that had seen plenty of use. His face was tanned dark by sun and wind, with strong features and eyes that she could not quite make out from a distance, but seemed to be studying everything with careful attention. He rode like a man who had spent more time on horseback than on his own 2 feet, moving with the kind of easy grace that came from thousands of miles in the saddle. He reined in his horse 20 feet from where she stood and removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that needed cutting and a face that was more rugged than handsome, but somehow appealing in its honesty. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she had imagined, with a slight drawl that spoke of his Missouri roots. "Miss Keller." "Yes." Her own voice sounded thin and uncertain. "You must be Mr. Reid." "Benjamin, please." He dismounted smoothly and walked toward her, leading his horse. Up close, she could see that his eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they were studying her with an intensity that made her feel naked and exposed. "I hope I am not arriving at an inconvenient time. I found myself able to leave Denver earlier than expected." "No, not at all." "You are welcome." The formal words felt absurd given the circumstances, but she clung to them like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. "Please, come inside. You must be tired from your journey." He glanced past her at the house, taking in the peeling paint around the windows, the missing tiles on the roof, the general air of neglect that no amount of hard work from 3 people could entirely disguise. Then his eyes moved to the barn, to the empty corrals that should have been full of horses and cattle, to the fields beyond that showed more dust than grass. She saw something shift in his expression, a kind of understanding that made her want to turn and run. "Where are your ranch hands, Miss Keller?" he asked quietly. "They are out with the herd," she said automatically, the lie coming easily now after so many repetitions in her letters. But even as she spoke, she could see that he did not believe her. His eyes had already catalogued too much, seen too clearly the truth she had tried to hide. "And your father? I was hoping to meet him and discuss our arrangement properly." This was the moment she had been dreading. Miriam opened her mouth to deliver another lie, but under Benjamin Reed's steady gray gaze, the words would not come. Instead, she found herself saying, "He is dead, shot down 6 weeks ago by a man who wants this land." The bald truth hung between them in the hot morning air. Benjamin's expression did not change, but something flickered in those storm-gray eyes that might have been anger or sadness or simply resignation. He took a long breath and settled his hat back on his head. "I see. And the prosperous ranch you described in your letters. The thriving cattle operation and your father's plans for retirement, all lies." The admission felt like a physical weight lifting from her shoulders even as shame burned in her cheeks. "Everything I wrote was lies, Mr. Reed. The ranch is nearly bankrupt. The cattle were sold off to pay debts. Clayton Moss, who owns most of the territory around here, has been trying to force me to sell, and when my father refused, one of his men killed him and called it self-defense. I have no help except Maria, who was my nurse, and her son Juan. I am alone here and I am desperate, and I wrote those letters because I thought if I could find a husband, I might have a chance to keep this place. I apologize for wasting your time and deceiving you. If you want to leave, I understand." The words spilled out in a rush, 3 months of deception and fear and desperation pouring out all at once. When she finished, she could not look at him, could not bear to see the disgust or anger that must surely be in his face. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then Benjamin Reed said, in that same quiet voice, "I rode 1,200 miles to get here, Miss Keller. I am not going to turn around and leave based on one conversation. Perhaps we should go inside and you can tell me the whole story. Then I will decide what to do." Miriam looked up, startled. His expression was unreadable, but there was no anger in it that she could see. He was watching her with those careful eyes, and she had the sudden uncomfortable feeling that he had known all along that something was wrong, that he had read between the lines of her letters and seen the truth she was trying to hide. Why, then, had he come? She led him inside, calling for Maria to bring water and coffee. The older woman appeared from the kitchen, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Benjamin before she nodded and disappeared again. Miriam gestured for Benjamin to sit at the long dining table, and she took a seat across from him, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. For the next hour, she told him everything. About her father's murder, about Clayton Moss and his determination to control all the water rights in the valley, about the debts that were crushing her and the bank that would foreclose within 3 months if she could not make a payment, about the loneliness and fear of the past 6 weeks, trying to keep the ranch running with no help and no hope. She told him about the advertisement she had placed in desperation, about the lies she had written in her letters, about the shameful plan to trap him into marriage before he knew the truth. Benjamin listened without interrupting, his face impassive, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the confession, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Why this ranch? Why is it so important that you risk everything to keep it?" The question surprised her. She had expected anger or accusations, not genuine curiosity. "Because it is my home," she said simply. "My grandfather came here in 1840 with nothing but a wagon and a dream. He built the irrigation system that brings water from the mountain springs. He made this land productive when everyone said it was impossible. My father spent his life expanding what his father built, and he died defending it. If I let Clayton Moss take it, then everything they worked for, everything they sacrificed, means nothing. And beyond that." She paused, trying to put into words something she had never fully articulated even to herself. "This land is part of me. I know every hill and valley, every rock and tree. I know where the best grazing is in spring and where the cattle shelter during storms. I know which wells run cold even in summer and which fences need constant repair. This is not just property to me, Mr. Reed. This is my family's legacy, and I am the last one left to defend it." Benjamin was quiet again, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. Finally he said, "Tell me about Clayton Moss. What kind of man is he?" "Ruthless," Miriam said immediately. "He came to the territory 15 years ago with money from back east, bought up several struggling ranches, and has been expanding ever since. He controls the sheriff, the bank, most of the businesses in town. When he wants something, he usually gets it. My father was one of the few ranchers who refused to sell to him because our water rights are valuable. We control access to one of the main springs that feeds into the Rio Grande. Without our land, Moss's eastern pastures have no reliable water source. So he had your father killed to force your hand. I cannot prove it, but yes. His foreman, a man named Deckard, was the one who pulled the trigger. He claimed my father drew on him first, but my father was not even wearing his gun that day. I know because I found him, and there was no holster on his body." Benjamin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the sheriff did nothing. The sheriff takes his orders from Moss. He ruled it self-defense within an hour and closed the case. What about friends? Other ranchers who might stand with you against Moss? Miriam shook her head. The ones who have not already sold to Moss are too afraid to cross him. And they see me as a woman alone, incapable of holding on to this place regardless of what Moss does. They think I should cut my losses and leave the territory. But you will not. I cannot. She met his eyes directly. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, Mr. Reed. I lied to you and brought you here under false pretenses. But I am asking anyway. If you leave now, I lose everything. If you stay, even for a little while, even just to maintain the appearance of a male presence on this ranch, it might give me time to find another solution. I do not expect you to marry me now, not after my deception. But please do not leave immediately. At least stay a few days. Let Clayton Moss see that I am not entirely alone. After that, you can go with my blessing and my apologies. Benjamin stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. Miriam held her breath, certain he was about to refuse, about to walk out the door and out of her life as suddenly as he had entered it. The moment stretched out, painful and tense, and she prepared herself for the rejection she knew she deserved. Then he turned around, and there was something in his face that she could not quite read. I knew your letters were full of lies, he said flatly. Or at least I suspected it strongly. The details did not add up. You described ranch operations in ways that did not quite make sense. You avoided certain questions and gave vague answers to others. In your third letter, you mentioned spring calving happening in June, but any real rancher would know that calving happens earlier. Little things like that made me wonder what you were hiding. Miriam felt her face flush hot. Then why did you come? If you knew I was lying, why ride all this way? Because I also read what you did not write. Benjamin crossed his arms, leaning back against the window frame. You wrote about the ranch, about your father, about life here, and underneath all the false details, I could sense something real. Desperation, yes, but also love for this place. Pride in what your family built. And loneliness. That came through clearly in every letter, even when you were describing things that were not true. I figured if a woman was desperate enough to lie that elaborately, there must be a damn good reason. So I came to find out what the truth was. And now that you know. Miriam's voice was barely a whisper. Now I am still deciding. He moved back to the table but did not sit down. I am not a rich man, Miss Keller, but I have about $3,000 saved from 10 years of hard work and careful living. That is enough to make a dent in your debts, but not enough to solve all your problems. I know cattle and horses. I know how to work land and manage a ranch. I can be useful here if I choose to stay. The question is whether you are prepared to be honest with me from this point forward. No more lies, no more deceptions. If we are going to work together to save this place, it has to be based on truth. Hope flared in Miriam's chest, painful and bright. You are considering staying. I rode 1,200 miles looking for a new start and a woman to build a life with. I find myself in the middle of a range war with a woman who is either very brave or very foolish, probably both. The situation is not what I expected, but then again, I have spent most of my life dealing with situations I did not expect. At least this one involves fighting for something worthwhile. He studied her for a long moment. I need to think about this, Miss Keller. I need to ride out and look at your land, assess what we are really dealing with. Then I will give you my answer. Is that acceptable? Yes. Miriam stood as well, feeling unsteady on her feet. Yes, of course. Take all the time you need. Juan can show you around, tell you whatever you need to know. I would rather you showed me, Benjamin said. If we are going to be partners in this, I need to understand how you see this land. Juan can come along if you like, but I want to hear it from you. So she took him out into the harsh New Mexico sun, and they rode for hours across the property that was her heritage and her burden. She showed him the irrigation channels her grandfather had dug, the pastures that had once supported 500 head of cattle, the lined shacks where hands used to stay during roundup. She showed him the spring that was the source of all the trouble, a clear pool of water bubbling up from deep underground, cold and pure even in the middle of summer. She explained the system of water rights, how her grandfather had been one of the first settlers and had claimed access to this spring before there was even a territorial government to make it official. She showed him the boundaries where her land met Clayton Moss's vast holdings, and she pointed out the places where Moss's men had cut her fences and driven off her cattle over the past months. Benjamin absorbed it all in silence, asking occasional questions, studying the land with the practiced eye of a man who understood what he was seeing. When they finally rode back to the ranch house as the sun was setting, painting the mountains purple and gold, he still had not told her his decision. That evening, Maria prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread and the last of the salt pork they had in the storehouse. They ate in the dining room, the three of them, Miriam, Benjamin, and Juan, with Maria bustling in and out from the kitchen. The conversation was stilted and awkward, and Miriam felt exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day. When the meal was finished, Benjamin excused himself and went outside, and she saw him standing in the courtyard, looking up at the stars that were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Maria touched her shoulder gently. "That is a good man," she said quietly in Spanish. "A strong man, but also a thoughtful one. If he stays, you must be worthy of that gift." "If he stays," Miriam repeated, watching Benjamin's silhouette against the twilight. "I am not sure why he would after everything I have done." "Because he sees you," Maria said simply. "Not the lies you told, but the truth underneath. That is a rare thing, child. Do not take it lightly." Miriam went outside, walking slowly across the courtyard to where Benjamin stood. He glanced at her as she approached but did not speak immediately. Together, they watched the night settle over the land, the temperature dropping quickly as it always did in the desert, the first cool breeze of evening stirring the dust. "I have made my decision," Benjamin said finally. "I will stay and help you fight for this ranch. But I need you to understand my terms." "Anything," Miriam said immediately. "First, no more lies, about anything. If there are other problems I do not know about, other debts or threats, you tell me now. Second, we marry as soon as it can be arranged. Not because I want to trap you, but because a married woman has more legal standing than a single one, and it will send a clear message to Clayton Moss that you are not alone. Third, this has to be a real partnership. You do not keep secrets from me, and I do not make decisions without consulting you. This is your land, your family's legacy, but if we are going to save it, we save it together. Are those terms acceptable to you?" Miriam could barely breathe. "You would marry me, after I lied to you for months." "You lied because you were desperate and scared and out of options," Benjamin said. "I have done things I am not proud of when I was desperate too. The question is not whether you lied then, but whether you will be honest now. Can you do that, Miriam?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent a strange warmth through her chest. "Yes," she said. "I can be honest. I will be honest. And yes, I accept your terms, all of them." He turned to face her fully then, and in the dim light she could see the hint of a smile on his face. "Then I suppose we are engaged, Miss Keller, though it is probably the strangest engagement in the history of the territory." Despite everything, Miriam found herself laughing, a sound that felt foreign after weeks of grief and fear. "I suppose it is. Thank you, Benjamin. You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," he said quietly. "Now we should get some rest." Tomorrow we need to start figuring out how to save your ranch and keep you alive in the process. Something tells me Clayton Moss is not going to take kindly to my presence here." He was right about that. 2 days later, while Benjamin was out with Juan repairing fences on the north pasture, Clayton Moss himself came riding up to the ranch house with 4 of his men. Miriam saw them coming from the kitchen window and felt her heart begin to pound, but she forced herself to walk out onto the porch calmly, her chin lifted, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Clayton Moss was a big man, running to fat now in his middle years but still powerful looking, with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. He dismounted and walked toward the porch, removing his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Miss Keller," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I heard you have a visitor. A cowboy from Colorado, they say. I thought I should come by and welcome him to the territory, offer him some friendly advice about the way things work around here." "Mr. Reed is not a visitor," Miriam said, keeping her voice level. "He is my fiancé, and he will be staying here permanently." Moss's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Is that so? How convenient for you. And here I thought you were all alone in the world. Funny how a fiancé appears just when you need one most. Makes a man wonder about the legitimacy of the arrangement." "Wonder all you like," Miriam said coldly. "Benjamin and I have been corresponding for months. He has come to help me run this ranch, and we will be married within the week." "A week? My, that is quick." "Almost as if you are desperate to have a man's name for protection." Moss's eyes hardened. "Let me give you some advice, Miss Keller, for your own good. This fiancé of yours does not know what he is getting into. This land is harsh, and it takes more than one cowboy to make a ranch profitable. The smart thing would be to accept my offer. I will give you a fair price for the property, enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere safer for a young woman like yourself." "I am not selling," Miriam said. "Not to you, not to anyone. This is my home, and I am not leaving it." Moss's expression darkened. "Your father said the same thing, if I recall. Stubborn man, your father. It did not end well for him." The threat was barely veiled, and Miriam felt anger surge through her fear. "Are you admitting that you had my father killed?" "I am not admitting anything," Moss said smoothly. "I am simply pointing out that accidents happen in this territory, especially to people who make poor decisions. I would hate to see you or your new fiancé suffer a similar fate." "Is that a threat, Moss?" The voice came from behind the house, and both Miriam and Moss turned to see Benjamin walking around the corner, Juan close behind him. Benjamin's hand rested casually on the revolver at his hip, and his face was hard as granite. "Because it sure sounded like a threat to me." Moss studied Benjamin for a long moment, taking in the worn gun belt, the confident stance, the cold gray eyes that did not waver. "You must be the fiancé from Colorado. Benjamin Reed, is it?" "That is right." Benjamin walked to the porch and stood beside Miriam, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "And you must be Clayton Moss. Miriam has told me all about you." "Has she now? And did she also tell you that she is sitting on a bankrupt ranch with no cattle, no hands, and debts that will bury her within a few months? Did she tell you that you are walking into a losing battle?" "She told me everything," Benjamin said. "And I am staying anyway. So you can take your threats and your offers and ride back to your own land, Moss. This ranch is not for sale." Moss's face flushed red with anger. "You do not know who you are dealing with, cowboy. I own this territory. The sheriff, the bank, the judge, they all answer to me. If I want this land, I will get it, one way or another." "Maybe," Benjamin said calmly, "but it is going to cost you a hell of a lot more than you were planning on. See, I have spent the last 10 years working cattle drives across this territory. I know a lot of people." Rangers, marshals, honest lawmen who do not take kindly to men who murder ranchers and steal their land. I already sent a telegraph to a friend of mine in Santa Fe, a territorial marshal named Jack Sawyer. He is very interested in the circumstances of Samuel Keller's death. He will be riding down here in a few weeks to ask some questions. So if I were you, I would be very careful about what accidents befall this ranch from now on. It was a bluff. Benjamin had told Miriam as much the night before when they had discussed how to handle Moss. But it was a good bluff, and Miriam saw uncertainty flicker across Moss's face. The big man recovered quickly, but the damage was done. He settled his hat back on his head and mounted his horse. "You are making a big mistake, Reed," he said. "Both of you. But I suppose some people have to learn the hard way. Just remember I gave you a chance to walk away." He rode off with his men, and Miriam felt her knees go weak with relief. Benjamin put a hand on her arm, steadying her. "You did well," he said quietly. "You did not let him see you were afraid." "I was terrified," she admitted. "And that story about the marshal is partly true," Benjamin said. "I do know Jack Sawyer, and I did send him a telegram. I do not know if he will come or not, but at least Moss has to consider the possibility. It might make him think twice before he does anything too obvious." Over the following days, Benjamin threw himself into the work of reviving the ranch with an energy that amazed Miriam. He rode into Las Cruces and made inquiries about work, coming back with 3 drifters who were willing to sign on for low wages and the promise of better pay when the ranch was back on its feet. He negotiated with the bank, using his own savings as collateral to buy them more time on the debts. He rode out every morning with Juan and the new hands, repairing fences, clearing irrigation channels, assessing what would be needed to start rebuilding the herd. And in the evenings, he sat with Miriam at the dining table, going over accounts and making plans, talking through strategies for the future. They talked about other things too, slowly learning each other through conversation rather than letters. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera, and being raised by an uncle who drank too much and worked him too hard. He told her about his first cattle drive at 15, about learning the business from trail bosses and experienced hands, about saving every cent he could because he knew that working for wages his whole life would never give him the future he wanted. She told him about her mother, about learning to read from Shakespeare and Dickens, about the years when the ranch had prospered, and her father had talked about building a real house in town where she could have a proper social life. She told him about the loneliness of the past few years, as her mother's illness drained their finances, and then her death left a hole in the family that never quite healed. She told him about her father's stubbornness and pride, about the arguments they had over his refusal to sell to Moss, about the guilt she felt that she had not done more to convince him to compromise. They were married on a Saturday morning in the small Catholic church in Las Cruces, with Maria and Juan as witnesses, and a handful of townspeople looking on with curiosity. Miriam wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and Benjamin wore a new suit he had bought in town with money he could not afford to spend. The priest was old and kind, and he did not ask too many questions about the hasty wedding. When Benjamin kissed her at the end of the ceremony, it was gentle and brief, the kiss of 2 people still learning each other. But Miriam felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the New Mexico sun. They had a small celebration at the ranch that evening, Maria cooking a feast with the little they had, and even the new ranch hands joining in for music and dancing. Juan played guitar, and one of the drifters had a harmonica, and they made music that echoed off the courtyard walls and out into the desert night. Benjamin asked Miriam to dance, and she went into his arms feeling awkward and uncertain, but he guided her through the steps with patient strength. And by the second song she was laughing, feeling lighter than she had in months. That night, lying in the darkness of her room that was now their room, Miriam felt Benjamin's hand find hers under the covers. He did not push for more, seeming to understand that intimacy would come in its own time, when they were ready. Instead, he just held her hand and said quietly, "We are going to make this work, Miriam. Your ranch, our marriage, all of it. I promise you that." "I believe you," she whispered, and realized she meant it. The summer months were brutal with work. The ranch was in worse shape than Benjamin had initially assessed, and every day brought new challenges and setbacks. The well in the south pasture ran dry and had to be redug. A late summer storm destroyed part of the barn roof. One of the horses went lame and had to be put down. The expenses kept mounting, eating away at Benjamin's savings faster than either of them had anticipated. But there were victories, too. Benjamin rode to Tucson and bought 30 head of cattle from a rancher there, young stock that would form the basis of a new herd. He hired 2 more hands, experienced men who had worked for Miriam's father years ago, and were willing to come back now that there was a man running the place again. The irrigation system was restored to full function, and water flowed through the channels the way it had in her grandfather's time. Green began to return to the pastures, slowly but surely, and through it all, Miriam and Benjamin grew closer. The partnership they had agreed to in those first desperate days deepened into something real and warm. She learned his moods and habits, learned that he was quiet in the mornings until he had his coffee, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, that he worried constantly about money, but never let her see how stressed he truly was. He learned her strengths and fears, learned that she was tougher than she looked and smarter than he had given her credit for, that she had a head for figures, and a talent for managing people that made her invaluable in running the ranch operations. They talked late into the nights, lying side by side in the darkness, sharing their hopes and fears and dreams. He told her about his dream of building something permanent, a legacy he could pass on to children who would never have to grow up as hard as he had. She told him about her fear that she would fail her family, that all their sacrifices would be for nothing because she was not strong enough to hold onto what they had built. "You are stronger than you know," Benjamin told her one night, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her arm. "You survived things that would have broken most people. You fought when everyone told you to give up. That takes real courage, Miriam." "I did not feel courageous," she said softly. "I felt terrified all the time. I still do sometimes." "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said. "It is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You have more of that than anyone I have ever met." Their physical relationship developed slowly, built on trust and growing affection rather than rushed passion. The first time they made love, it was tender and somewhat awkward, both of them nervous and uncertain. But afterward, lying in each other's arms, Miriam felt a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. This was her husband, her partner, the man who had read between the lines of her desperate letters and come anyway. She loved him, she realized with sudden clarity. Somewhere between the lies and the truth, between fear and hope, she had fallen completely in love with Benjamin Reed. Clayton Moss did not give up his designs on the ranch, but he seemed to be biding his time, waiting for them to fail on their own. There were small harassments, fences cut, cattle spooked, supplies that went missing but nothing overt enough to prove his involvement. Benjamin met each challenge with steady determination, repairing what was broken, replacing what was lost, never letting Moss see that the attacks were having any effect. In September, the territorial marshal Benjamin had mentioned finally arrived. Jack Sawyer was a lean, weathered man with sharp eyes and a reputation for honesty in a territory where that was rare. He spent 3 days in Las Cruces, asking questions about Samuel Keller's death, talking to witnesses, examining the scene. He spoke with Miriam and Benjamin for hours, listening carefully to everything they had to say about Clayton Moss and his methods. In the end, he could not make a case that would stand up in court. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses had changed their stories or disappeared, and the physical evidence was long gone. But he gave them something almost as valuable. His presence and attention sent a message throughout the territory that someone was watching Clayton Moss, that his actions were not going entirely unnoticed by the law. "I cannot give you justice for your father," Sawyer told Miriam before he left. "But I can tell you that I will be keeping an eye on this situation. If anything happens to you or your husband, if there are any convenient accidents, I will be back, and I will dig until I find the truth. That is the best I can offer you." It was not enough, but it was something. After Sawyer left, the harassment from Moss's men decreased noticeably. They were still watching, still waiting, but they were being more careful now. By October, the ranch was starting to look like a ranch again rather than an abandoned property. The herd had grown to 70 head, small by territory standards but a real beginning. The buildings were repaired, the fences mended, the fields productive. They were still deep in debt, but they were making progress, and for the first time since her father's death, Miriam allowed herself to hope that they might actually survive. She was hanging laundry in the courtyard on a warm October morning when the realization hit her. She had missed her monthly courses, twice now. She sat down heavily on the edge of the fountain, her mind racing. A baby. She might be carrying Benjamin's child. The thought filled her with a complex swirl of emotions: joy, fear, wonder, anxiety. They were barely holding the ranch together as it was. How would they manage with a baby? But underneath all the practical concerns was a fierce gladness. A child would be proof that they were building something lasting, something that would outlive them both. Her family's legacy would continue, would grow, would flourish in ways her grandfather could never have imagined when he first claimed this land. She told Benjamin that evening, after Maria and the hands had retired for the night. They were sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge, and she simply took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach and said, "I think I am carrying your child." He went very still for a moment, his hand warm against her dress. Then he turned to her, and in the dim light from the window she could see his face, and what she saw there took her breath away. Wonder and joy and love so fierce it was almost frightening. "Are you certain?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Not completely, but fairly certain. I have missed twice now, and I feel different. Tired in a way I have never felt before. I think it is real, Benjamin." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt him trembling. When he pulled back, there were tears on his face, and he was not ashamed of them. "I never thought I would have this," he said hoarsely. "A family, a home, a child of my own. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you for taking a chance on me, for letting me be part of your life." "You saved my life," she said, her own tears falling now. "You came when I had nothing to offer but lies and desperation, and you stayed anyway. I love you, Benjamin. I love you so much." "I love you too," he said, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I think I started falling in love with you when I read your third letter, the one where you described watching the sunrise over the mountains and wishing you had someone to share it with. I could feel your loneliness, and I wanted to be the one to take it away. I knew then that I would come, no matter what the truth turned out to be." They sat together on the porch for hours, making plans for the future, talking about names and nurseries and all the small, mundane miracles of bringing a new life into the world. And for the first time since her father's death, Miriam felt truly, completely happy. The pregnancy progressed well through the winter months. Miriam continued to work as much as she could, though Benjamin fretted constantly about her overdoing it. Maria clucked and fussed, preparing baby clothes and making plans for the birth. Even the ranch hands seemed pleased by the news, working harder as if determined to ensure the ranch would be prosperous for the next generation. Clayton Moss made one more attempt to force them out. In January, he called in a loan he held on a neighboring property, foreclosed, and suddenly owned the land to their east. His cattle began grazing right up to the fence line, and his men made it clear they were watching everything that happened on the Keller ranch. But by then, Benjamin had made connections throughout the territory. He had friends now, allies, other ranchers who were tired of Moss's strong-arm tactics and were willing to stand together. When Moss tried to interfere with their water rights, claiming his new property gave him access to the same spring, Benjamin brought in a lawyer from Santa Fe who produced the original land grants and water claims from Miriam's grandfather. The case was heard before a territorial judge, and for once, money and influence were not enough. The law was clear, the documentation was solid, and Clayton Moss lost. It was not a complete victory. Moss still owned land surrounding them on 3 sides, still had wealth and power beyond anything they could match. But he had been defeated publicly, and that mattered. Other ranchers who had been quietly selling to him found the courage to refuse. The tide was turning slowly, and Benjamin and Miriam were at the center of it. The baby came in late March, a son born during a spring thunderstorm that rattled the windows and turned the courtyard fountain into a small waterfall. Miriam labored through the day and into the night, with Maria attending her and Benjamin pacing outside the door, forbidden from entering by both Maria and propriety, but refusing to leave. When the baby finally came, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Maria opened the door and called Benjamin inside. Tradition be damned. He came to the bedside, his face white with anxiety, and looked down at the tiny bundle in Miriam's arms. She saw his expression transform, saw him fall in love all over again, this time with the son who had his gray eyes and his strong jaw. "What should we name him?" he asked, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. Miriam had been thinking about this for months. "Samuel Benjamin Raid," she said. "After my father and his, so he will know where he came from and what we fought to give him." Benjamin nodded, unable to speak, and bent to kiss her forehead. Then he carefully took his son in his arms, holding the baby with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough cowboy hands, and Miriam watched her husband become a father and felt her heart might burst with the fullness of her happiness. The years that followed were not easy. Ranching in the New Mexico territory was never easy, and they had more than their share of challenges. Droughts and storms, cattle diseases and market fluctuations, the endless struggle to keep ahead of debts and expenses. But they weathered it all together, partners in every sense of the word. Clayton Moss never fully gave up his designs on their land, but he learned to leave them alone. The public defeat in court had damaged his reputation, and other ranchers had rallied around Benjamin and Miriam in ways that made outright attacks too risky. An uneasy peace settled over the valley, not friendship but a mutual agreement to coexist. 2 years after Samuel was born, Miriam gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, red-haired and spirited like Miriam's mother had been. 3 years after that came another son, Jacob, who had Benjamin's quiet nature and Miriam's sharp mind. The house that had been so empty and quiet during those desperate months when Miriam was alone filled with life and noise and laughter. The ranch prospered. Benjamin's hard work and Miriam's management skills combined to create something special. They expanded carefully, buying more cattle when they could afford it, hiring hands during busy seasons, building a reputation for quality stock and honest dealing. Other ranchers sought Benjamin's advice, and Miriam became known as a woman who could negotiate deals as shrewdly as any man. On their 10th anniversary, Benjamin took Miriam back to the church in Las Cruces, where they had married in such haste and uncertainty. They renewed their vows, this time with their 3 children watching, with Maria crying happy tears, with half the territory invited to the celebration afterward. And when the priest asked if they would continue to honor and cherish each other, they answered together, voices strong and certain, knowing they had already proven those vows true through 1,000 small acts of love and partnership over a decade of shared life. That evening, back at the ranch, Miriam and Benjamin stood together in the courtyard where he had first told her he would stay. The fountain ran again now, restored to its original beauty, and the sound of water playing over stone mixed with the voices of their children playing before bedtime. "Do you ever regret it?" Miriam asked, leaning back against her husband's chest as his arms came around her. "Coming here based on letters full of lies, walking into this mess." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking, taking the question seriously as he always did. Then he said, "The letters might have been full of lies about the ranch and your situation, but the woman I fell in love with through those letters was real. Your strength, your determination, your fierce love for this place and your family, that was all true. So no, I do not regret it. Not for a single moment. You gave me something I never thought I would have. A home, a family, a purpose. I would ride those 1,200 miles again in a heartbeat." Miriam turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered, sun-darkened face in her hands. "I love you," Benjamin rayed. "Thank you for reading between the lines. Thank you for coming anyway." "I love you too," he said, and kissed her as the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, as their children's laughter echoed through the home they had fought so hard to keep, as the land her grandfather had claimed and her father had defended stretched out around them, secure now for another generation. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Samuel grew tall and strong, learning the ranch business from his father and the history of the land from his mother. Rose proved to have a gift for horses, gentle and patient with even the most skittish animals. Jacob surprised them all by showing an interest in books and learning, and they sent him to school in Santa Fe, where he thrived. Maria lived to be 83, sharp and bossy to the very end, and when she died peacefully in her sleep, the entire valley turned out for her funeral. Juan took over as foreman, running the ranch hands with quiet competence, and eventually married a girl from Las Cruces, who gave him 4 children who called Benjamin and Miriam uncle and aunt, and treated the ranch as their second home. Clayton Moss died of a heart attack in 1895, and to everyone's surprise, his son proved to be a different man than his father. He came to Benjamin and Miriam and apologized for the past, asking if they could start fresh as neighbors. It was not easy to forgive, but they tried for the sake of the valley and the future, and over time a cautious friendship developed where there had once been bitter enmity. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. By the turn of the century, they ran 3,000 head of cattle across land that had expanded to include several neighboring properties, whose owners had sold to them rather than to larger conglomerates. The Keller Reed Ranch became known throughout the territory as a model operation, and young ranchers came from miles around to learn from Benjamin and Miriam. But more than the material success, what mattered was the life they built together. The family gatherings where 3 generations crowded around the dining table Maria had presided over for so long. The quiet evenings on the porch, watching grandchildren play in the courtyard. The deep, abiding partnership that had grown from those desperate letters into something unshakable and eternal. On their 30th anniversary, Miriam found the old letters she had written to Benjamin all those years ago, stored carefully in a trunk in the attic. She brought them down and they read them together, laughing at some of the more outrageous lies she had told, marveling at how young and desperate she had been, how lost and afraid. "I am glad I did not know then what I know now," Miriam said, folding the letters carefully and tying them with a ribbon. "If I had known how hard it would be, I might not have had the courage to write these. And if I had known the full truth from the beginning, I might not have come," Benjamin admitted. "Sometimes ignorance and faith are necessary ingredients for miracles." "Is that what we are?" Miriam smiled. "A miracle, you are," Benjamin said seriously. "You and this ranch and our family, and every day I get to wake up next to you. All of it is a miracle I do not deserve but am grateful for every single day." They stored the letters away again, a piece of history preserved for future generations, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. And that night, lying together in the darkness as they had for 30 years, Benjamin took Miriam's hand just as he had on their wedding night and said the same thing he had said then. "We made it work." "We did," Miriam agreed, squeezing his hand. "Against all odds, we built something beautiful." The years moved on, as years do. Samuel took over day-to-day operations of the ranch, freeing Benjamin and Miriam to travel for the first time in their lives. They went to California, to Colorado, back to Missouri, so Benjamin could show her where he had grown up. But they always came home to New Mexico, to the land that was in their blood, to the ranch that had been saved by desperation and love, and a cowboy who could read between the lines. Rose married a veterinarian from Albuquerque and gave them 6 grandchildren who spent every summer on the ranch. Jacob became a lawyer in Santa Fe but came home often, eventually serving in the territorial legislature and fighting for the rights of small ranchers against larger interests, carrying on the fight his parents had begun. Benjamin and Miriam grew old together, their hair turning gray and then white, their bodies slowing down but their minds still sharp, their love still strong. They sat on the porch every evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands as they had since the beginning, finding peace in each other's presence. Benjamin died first peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 78. Miriam held his hand as he passed, whispering her love, thanking him one last time for reading her desperate letters and coming anyway, for saving her ranch and her life and her heart. She buried him on a hill overlooking the spring that had been the source of so much trouble and so much blessing, where he could watch over the land they had fought so hard to keep. She lived another 5 years without him, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a sprawling family that had grown from those desperate, lie-filled letters. And when she died, also peacefully, also in her sleep, they buried her beside Benjamin on the hill, 2 stones standing side by side, marking the resting place of the woman who had written lies she had to tell and the cowboy who had read between the lines and come anyway. The ranch continued, passed down through generations, still bearing the Keller Reed name, still prosperous, still a testament to what 2 people could build when desperation and faith and love came together in just the right way. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Organ Mountains and painted the world in gold and purple. People swore they could see two figures standing on the hill, holding hands, watching over the land they had loved and fought for, and finally, after years of struggle and triumph, found peace together in the New Mexico soil they had both called home.